Hello and welcome to week number 7 of our Applied Food Science course, and today we're going fishing. So, what do we need to know about fish? Well, first off, the big difference between fish meat and the other meat that we've been talking about so far in this course is this guy right here, water, dihydrogen monoxide, H2O, whatever you call it. It's integral to understanding fish, their flavors, and their unique cooking methods and ideas. So, let's hit it off with something we're all interested in, the health aspects of fish. So why would you pick fish over, say, a delicious cow steak or some nice pulled pork? Well, the big thing when it comes to fish, as opposed to other land animals, is that fish are considerably more lean than land animals. That is to say, they've got much less fat to them than the land animals do. And we'll get to why that is in a little bit. But when we do talk about the fat in fish, the fat in fish is actually way better for us than the fat in land animals. And here's why. And this will come back to so many aspects of fish cookery. Fish live in water, and water is cold. That's right. Most water around the world is very cold compared to air temperature, right? Room temperature is usually about 75 degrees. That's kind of the standard set temperature for life on land. Whereas in the sea, it's usually somewhere between 32 degrees and maybe 50 degrees in the tropics, right? If you really want to go to tropical waters, you can obviously find warmer, but most fish live in that temperature range. And what that means is they are cold. Now, when you get cold, you need a different kind of fat than when you're warm, right? Because when you're warm, fat very much acts like a liquid. It's a fluid. Think of butter, right? Butter, it's not quite a liquid, it's not quite a solid. It's very mushy. That's the kind of fats that we have. Those are usually saturated fats. Remember, those are the ones like this bad boy that don't have any extra kinks in them. And if you get multiple of them together, they can stack really, really well. Well, what about fish? Fish have slightly unsaturated fats for the most part. They still have more saturated than unsaturated, but they do have some key unsaturated fats. And the reason they have those is because the kinks in them, like this guy, right? You can see there's a kink right here. They keep them from stacking on top of each other, and they keep them more fluid when it gets cold and they all start to squeeze together. Now, this guy in particular is very important. Now, you'll notice his kink is in a very specific location. It is 1, 2, 3 kinks from the end. Now, another word for end is omega. So you may recognize this guy as an omega-3 fatty acid. Now, omega-3 fatty acids are wildly important to our health because we can't make them. We can make lots of stuff. There's lots of stuff our bodies are really good at making. Omega-3 fatty acids, not one of them. So, fish are a fantastic source of omega-3s. There's walnuts, there's certain berries and nuts that also have them, but fish far and away have the most readily available omega-3s for us to consume. Now, if we flip the spectrum, what about the dangers of fish? Turns out, due to a lot of recent industrialization of the world, fishing and fish in general have become a lot less safe than they once were, which is a total bummer. But the big idea here is that anytime there's an industrial plant, they're going to have waste. Inevitably, there will be waste, whether it's chemical or biological or whatever. And guess where that waste ends up? Most of the time it's going to end up in water somewhere. Now, there are places that are really good at handling this, But there's been such neglect over the years, and really people didn't realize this was going to have such an effect on our fish and the fishing culture that people just kind of went rampant with this at first. So nowadays you've got really high levels of things like mercury and other heavy metals in our waterways, and it's so prevalent that it's made its way up the food chain, and now there are fish with dangerously high levels of things like mercury. And that is not good eats. Mercury is actually will kind of inhibit your nerve firings, which is no bueno. So if you want a complete list of those, there's tons of lists on the internet. Definitely check that out if that's a concern to you. Now, one of the other concerns that a lot of people have is bacteria, right? Fish spoil really fast. And this goes back to what we first talked about. Fish live in the cold. So the bacteria and the microbes that live on them generally prefer colder temperatures to warmer temperatures. That means when you take if you take a beef steak, and this thing's used to really cooking, right? 75 outside, 100 degrees inside, this thing is hot. You throw that thing in the fridge, those bacteria are shut down. Now a fish, you take a fish out of a 40-degree lake and you put it into your 40-degree fridge, those bacteria are fine. They're chilling, they're whatever, that's the temperature they're used to. So usually fish often spoil a lot faster than other meats solely because the bacteria that's on them already tends to like colder temperatures more than warmer temperatures. Now you can avoid this, of course, by freezing the fish, and if you freeze the fish, you really got to go at it, which is why, for me, we live in Arizona. I live in Arizona. There is no body of water close to us that is going to provide a good source of fresh fish. So for me, I always go vacuum sealed, freeze dried fish. That's the way to go. You may be tempted in the market, you see all the beautiful fish laid out, and that's fine. It turns out actually a lot of those are just thawed out frozen fish. So I just go for the frozen fish. A lot of fishing vessels have gotten really good at freezing the fish literally as they come out of the water. And that really preserves the freshness and can eliminate a lot of the safety hazards that you have to deal with. Because the longer that they're thawed, that they're in the fridge temperature zone, the more dangerous they can be. So, enough about health and safety and such. Let's get down to the nitty-gritty. What is going on with fish? Well, fish are a little different than land animals. Land animals, we kind of talked about as a whole, and there are lots of different types of land animals. But for fish, there's only two types, really, that we have to be concerned about, and that is saltwater fish, that is to say fish that live in oceans or salty seas, and freshwater fish. Okay, and there are some really key differences that I want to talk about, but to talk about them, how about we go for a swim? You see, I have here my handy-dandy aquarium of science. And what you can see, other than the beautiful glare of the computer screen, is that we have a container filled with water here. Now, this right now is fresh water. That is to say, there's not a lot of salt or other things dissolved in this right now. So, if we take a freshwater fish, as you can see, if you can, it says fresh on the side there, and we plop him in here, let's see what happens. Well, looks like he's not quite sinking, he's not quite floating, he's suspended, and that's exactly what fish want. Now, fish spend their entire lives in water, and the great advantage to water is that if you get your concentrations of things inside you, the salts and amino acids and things, just right, you can just float along and not have to worry about anything, just like our freshwater friend here. Now let's see what would happen if we took a saltwater fish and stuck him in here. So here we've got our saltwater fish. And saltwater fish, again, are used to much more salty environment, and so they are going to sink. Because their cells are used to that salt, they've got a lot more amino acids and other things to counterbalance that salt concentration. Okay, so not great. This is great for our freshwater fish. He's suspended, but our saltwater fish is sinking. That's not what they want. They would have to use their muscles constantly, and that's no bien. So let's see what happens when we up the salt level. Yes, I know it's sugar, but it'll work the same. Check this out. So if we add a whole bunch of salt to this water, and we mix it up, we get it nice and dissolved. Now let's see what's going to happen here. So what you should be able to see here is that our freshwater friend right over here is becoming much more buoyant. He's floating a lot more, which is kind of the opposite problem that our saltwater friend had initially, in that rather than sinking to the bottom, now our freshwater friend is floating to the very top. And as I add more and more and more salt, in fact, the ocean is about 3% salt by weight, which, if you do the math, is a ton of salt. But as we add more, you see that our saltwater friend, we'll see if we can get these guys to come over here, is starting to suspend himself. Kind of the, you can see the front edge of this coming up. And of course, as we add more salt, our freshwater friend is becoming wildly buoyant and is just not going to settle down for nothing. So, what can we learn from this? Well, freshwater fish, on average, have much less protein content in their cells because they don't need stuff in their cells. They're mostly water so that they can balance with the lack of salt and other things in fresh water. Whereas our saltwater fish are far and away going to have much more protein in their cells, which is going to allow them to be more buoyant when you're in saltwater environment. And that is going to lead to a lot of differences when we talk about, say, cooking methods or just general trends about these fish. Now, one thing that's incredibly interesting to me, especially, is there's a protein called TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, and this compound. Is it a protein? I think it's a compound. We'll say compound to be safe. This compound is only found in our saltwater fish. And why is that significant? Well, it makes sense, right? Saltwater fish need more protein, so it makes sense they have this extra one. Well, here's the thing. When TMAO is exposed to air and the fish is dead, so it's not maintaining this at all, TMAO will lose its oxygen and just become TMA, trimethylamine. Now, you may know trimethylamine a little better by its smell. In fact, this is the molecule that's responsible for that fishy smell that you get, either when you cook fish or when you're, say, walk by the fish counter at your local Mega Mart and you smell that fishiness. It's this TMAO losing its oxygen, becoming TMA, and TMA smells pretty fishy and not that great in my opinion. So here's what's interesting. Freshwater fish, by and large, don't have very much of this stuff. That means that if you really are concerned about, say, fishiness taste or the fishiness smell when you're cooking or just buying fish, freshwater fish don't have that smell, don't have that protein or that compound. So if that's a concern to you, go for the saltwater or go for the freshwater fish. They don't have it. Now, all of this leads to another point, and that's that far and away fish have white meat. Now, last week when we were talking about meats, we talked about how white meat, muscles, like in, say, chicken breasts, is primarily for very quick, short bursts of speed, whereas red meat is for much more prolonged activity that you're going to have to do for a really long time. Now, just like what we talked about with the buoyancy thing, fish are generally just chilling there. They're not doing a lot of moving, they're just floating along in the water. That means that most of their muscle is devoted to short, quick bursts of speed and maneuverability that they need to kind of access when there's a predator or something else going on, or they're hunting or whatever. So a lot of their meat is white, which makes sense. Now, there are a couple notable exceptions, of course. Tuna, for one, is a big one, right? It's got that beautiful pink-red meat. Now, tuna has some red and some white, and the main reason is that tunas do a lot more swimming and migrating than most other fish. They're very mobile, and so they need those red muscles to be able to swim for a really long time. Now, one you might be thinking of and thinking, well, where does this fall? Is salmon. And there are a few other fish like this, but salmon is that beautiful kind of orange-pink color. What's up with that? Well, it turns out that salmon are that color not because of their need for red or white muscle. They're actually a pretty even split there. What that comes from is the crustaceans that they primarily feed on, which have a kind of beta-carotene-like molecule in them, which essentially turns their flesh orange. And now that goes for wild salmon exclusively. Unless farm-raised salmon are fed this crustacean, they generally maintain kind of a light pink color to them, and a lot of the really salmon-y colors you'll see on farm-raised fish actually come from that. They'll supplement it, they'll dye the fish just to give it that salmon-y color, which is fine. Farm-raised fish can be really good, especially for not hurting ecosystems and stuff like that. But that's what's going on with them. So now, when we talk about a fish, well, let's talk about what makes up a fish. You probably know really well what a fish looks like, right? You've seen the scribble of the Jesus fish, some people call it. We all know what fish look like. Well, what's going on there? Let's start from the outside. On the outside of our fish, we have skin, we have scales. Okay? And what's really important here is right under the skin, there's a layer of fat. And remember, fish fat is actually pretty good. It's much better than animal fat. So this fish fat, or I should say land animal fat, we don't want to let fish think that they're excluded, but this layer of fat underneath their skin actually keeps them insulated. It keeps them warm in this extremely cold water. And the scales are usually just for protection, right? And also streamlining, okay? Skin tends to be really sensitive to water in particular, and so the skin or the scales really help it to isolate it from that. Now, underneath the skin, right, we've got our muscles. And the cool thing about fish is that they essentially are made of 4 big muscles. And if you fillet a fish correctly, you can just get 2 really nice fillets. You don't have to deal with all of the different types of meat parts like we have in, say, a cow, where there's, 50 different cuts that you can make. Fish are easy. They're usually just 1 muscle on the right, 1 muscle on the left. I say 1, each of those is actually 2, kind of a dorsal and a ventral, or top and bottom part to that muscle, which you can really clearly see if, say, you get a nice hunk of salmon and there's kind of that divide between the top and bottom, and there will be a little notch in there. But that's beside the point. Okay, what we're really trying to say is the beautiful thing about the muscles of fish is that's the part we eat, and so it's really easy to get big, nice fillets from these fish because they're really just 4 muscles. Okay. Now, inside those muscles, there's a problem. There's the bones. But here's the thing about the fish bones. fish bones are traditionally much more light, both in composition and just in texture and feel than land mammal bones, and that makes sense. It should, again, because the bones that we have are because we live on land. We're constantly subjected to gravity, and we need a nice structure to keep us up. Whereas fish, really, they only need their skeletons so that they don't fall apart. Okay, so their bones don't need to be as rigid. They don't need as much calcium in them. So generally, bones of fish are a lot more calcium light, and some of them can even dissolve completely at higher cooking temperatures or longer cooking times. So to each fish their own. Now, when it comes to cooking fish, there are really two problems that we're going to run into. One is the shape of the fish. Now, if you've ever seen a fish fillet, the problem is in the middle you got this nice fatty fillet, but what's going to happen is it's going to taper down to a different size around the edges. Now, if there's anything we've learned so far, it's that when you cook something, if you want to cook it evenly, it needs to be an even piece. That's a problem, and we'll get into some solutions in a little bit. But the other problem is that fish is notorious for having wildly different qualities, not only between species, but also even among fish of the same species. And it can depend on lots of factors, from whether they're mating, where they were caught, what their diet is, how old they are. There's so many factors that go into fish quality that it can be really hard to establish firm cooking rules based on the fish. But we'll get into some workarounds, like I said, in just a second. All right? So, let's talk about actually cooking them. Well, the thing about fish, like we said before, they live in the cold. So what that means is that when you're cooking fish, you don't need to get the temperature as high to cook the fish as thoroughly as you do for land animals. Okay, land animals, most of the time you need to get up to at least 140 degrees before you start seeing anything going on cooking-wise. Fish, for the most part, start cooking around 120 degrees, and they'll end cooking around 140. Or that's kind of when they dry out, they really reach their peak. So that's really low. And that does raise a lot of problems when it comes back to a lot of the bacteria and the microbes that are on these things, because we need to get these things up to 160 degrees to make sure we kill those bacteria. So how do we work around that? Now, here's what I'm going to say is, if you're going to cook your fish always to 160 degrees, I guarantee you will dry it out every single time. So the best workarounds, buy frozen fish. You can either kill bacteria by cooking the crap out of it or freezing the crap out of it. I prefer the freezing because then I can cook it well myself. The other thing you can do is make sure you're going to a really trusty fishmonger, someone who really knows what's going on in their stock. Unfortunately, a lot of those have been lost in these big supermarkets nowadays, but you do what you can, okay? Make sure when you get the fish, you rinse it, you wash it really, really well on the outside. And if you can, sear the outsides of the fish, because again, that's where most of the bacteria is. But anyway, back to the cooking part. So when we cook, there's really three options for how we can go about cooking fish to make sure we get a good quality fish that's not overcooked, but is still delicious and cooked through. Now, the first thing we need to remember is that if we're going to cook this irregular shape, we need to somehow cook it evenly. And there's really two ways that we can do that. Both of them mean that we need to surround this fish with something that can really gently and evenly get the heat into that fish. Okay, so one, we can submerge it in something. Poaching fish is wonderful because it's really easy to control the temperature of your poaching liquid and really, bring it up nice and easy to that perfect temperature you want it at. Now, there are other ways. Oven cooking is really good because even though it's not submerging it in a liquid, remember, oven cooking is basically submerging it in air. Okay, and that air does a really good job of nice, gentle heat transfer into that fish and is really gonna cook it a lot more evenly than, say, in a pan where you've got direct heat. You want that indirect heat. The other way is we can cover it in something. That's why fried fish often is so delicious and flaky and moist and wonderful, because that breading essentially soaks up all the direct heat and then evenly distributes the rest of that heat into the fish. And that is definitely some good eats. Now, there are other methods. You can cover it with, say, a layer of salt or different crusts. Up to you, but you definitely don't want direct heat if you're just going to cook it using one method. Now, that brings me to my personal favorite, and that is doing a two-step cooking process. Because for me, one of the best things about fish is when you can really sear that skin and get that nice crispy skin with that beautiful flaky fish on top. Now, one of the best ways to do this is to fry or saute in the pan just real quick. Very high, very hot. Just get that sear and then throw your fish in the oven to finish up. With this, you get temperatures above the boiling point, meaning you're going to get some Maillard reaction, right? The proteins and the sugars in there caramelizing together and browning. But then you're going to get the nice even cooking that the oven offers. This works really well, especially for thicker cuts of fish, because thinner cuts, you can just kind of saute them, and because the cut is so small, the heat is essentially evenly distributed. But if you get a big chunk of salmon or tilapia or mackerel or tuna, you really, really want to make sure that you're evenly cooking the rest of the fish. Okay, now the final choice is to cut your fish up into evenly sized chunks. Now here's the problem. That's not very appetizing. And a lot of times when you do that, the fish gets real crumbly, right? You really never see cubes of fish, right? So this is best absolutely for things like stews and soups. One thing to remember, though, is that, again, fish cooks at a much lower temperature than most things we're used to. So if you're going to make a fish stew or a fish soup, you're going to definitely want to add your fish or shellfish at the end rather than at the beginning, because if you add them at the beginning, they're definitely going to be overcooked. So there's fish in a nutshell. Let's review real quick. Health-wise, fish have really good fats for us. I didn't mention this before, but they don't have any of that cholesterol that we were worried about earlier. They're really good. They're a great alternative to land animal meats. However, they do have a lot of concerns as far as heavy metals, toxins, bacteria. Remember, fish live in the cold. The bacteria like the cold. So if you're going to get them, get it frozen or make sure you sear the heck out of that skin. So we've also got our difference between saltwater and freshwater fish. Saltwater fish traditionally have a lot more protein, a lot more amino acids in their cells, which help them stay buoyant, that is to say float in saltwater, whereas freshwater fish really don't have that. That's why saltwater fish tend to smell more fishy, because of the protein or the compound TMAO, trimethylamine oxide, which loses its oxygen and becomes trimethylamine. That's our fishy smell. Now, when it comes to our fish, we have white meat traditionally on fish because they don't swim a lot except for in short bursts, so they have more white meat than red meat, except for salmon. They're pink because of the crustaceans that they eat. Now, what is a fish made of? Well, it's got scales, it's got skin on the outside with a thin layer of fat on the inside. Side note, that's why the skin fries up so nicely, because it's got that subcutaneous or under the skin fat. That helps insulate the fish. But the fish really only has 4 main muscles, which means getting fillets off there is a piece of cake and can be very delicious. They also have bones, but the bones are a lot lighter and less dense than ours, meaning that sometimes they can actually dissolve during the cooking process. When you cook a fish, you definitely want to maintain a temperature under 140 degrees. Otherwise, you're going to totally dry out the fish, and it's going to be pretty gross. Fish do start cooking once you get up to about 120 degrees. To combat this difficulty, you're going to want to either cover the fish in something to ensure even cooking. You're going to want to submerge it in either a liquid or your oven to make sure that it gets a nice, gentle, even heat, or double cook that bad boy. You're going to want to sear it and then throw it in the oven, or poaching, or whatever is your preferred method of choice. Or finally, you can cut it up into little pieces and make sure that those pieces are sized so that they do cook evenly. But that is best for soups and stews. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the bonus round.